Well, on behalf of the family, we are certainly absolutely honored and deeply moved that that the university has seen fit to honor our matriarch in this way. We are fully aware of the contributions and the selflessness that she provided to not just St. Lucia but to education across the region. It was so interesting that upon her death is where most of her family really did find out all of the things that she not only had done in the past but was doing at that point in time. And her passion certainly was education. She started here, and her tenure with the University of the West Indies was a long and fruitful one, which I think prepared her for a lot of the other things she did in her burgeoning career as she went on. We also know that there are many of our educational persons and our St. Lucians who have now gone ahead and are leaders in our society who were in many ways touched by her and as in their young growth, and therefore it is really pleasing to see that the University of the West Indies has chosen to honor her this way, and for us it's important that her memory lives on in that way, and we are certainly privileged to have been a part of her life as well as the University of the West Indies. So we thank them immensely for continuing to keep her work alive through this medium.
Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, special warm welcome to our guest speaker, Dr. Merle Hodge. And I know that she has spent a wonderful day in St. Lucia and has already applied to become an honorary St. Lucian, as they all do when they come here. Welcome to the 5th annual Patricia Charles Memorial Lecture. It's been 5 years. Now, for those of you who have lately joined our faithful following, I would just like to recall the first 4 lectures in the series. I see some old faithfuls, but I also see some new faces. The first lecture was given by Dr. Hollis Liverpool, otherwise known as Chalk Dust, and he gave a lecture on crime and calypso. The second lecture was delivered by Professor Carolyn Cooper, and her lecture was entitled Islands Beyond Envy, Liberating Nation Language in the Caribbean. The third lecture was given by our own Governor General, Her Excellency Dame Paulette Louisy, and her lecture was entitled Negotiating a National Agenda for Development, the Role of Culture. And last year, amidst the torrential rains, we had Dr. Joel Warrican delivering Exorcising the Demons of Colonialism, Creating Participating Citizens Through Democracy in Education. And I can really imagine Pat enjoying every single one of those lectures. Now, in her lecture 2 years ago, Her Excellency explored the conundrum: is development a cultural expression, or is culture a facet of development? She concluded that there is need to study and research the local culture as a starting point for dialogue about development and how people drive development. She recommended a multidisciplinary collaborative research paper, a project, that would bring together cultural activists, economists, historians, sociologists, anthropologists, ethnologists, and linguists. This project, she said, would involve the study of our cultural behaviors, and the outputs of the project would guide our engagement with the outside world based on our understanding of who we are. Her Excellency suggested that it is this definition of ourselves which would then enable us to negotiate our developmental pathways. And I hope I have faithfully rendered the gist of your delivery. She has forgotten. Trust me, that was the gist. Your Excellency, we have not forgotten your exhortation, but I'm not sure how possible it would be to get such a massive research project off the ground in light of the dearth of funding these days. But we at the UWI Open Campus certainly intend to give a platform to all the disciplines mentioned by Her Excellency in order to keep the dialogue going. However, based on tonight's topic, what's the use of culture? I'm not sure that we will need to go any further with the dialogue, because we may very well be convinced that contrary to Her Excellency's opinion, culture is really no use at all. That will save us a ton of money. So it is with bated breath that I await tonight's lecture, and I anticipate the usual excellent quality of discourse, which is synonymous with the University of the West Indies events. Therefore, I would like to call on Mr. Vladimir Lucien, who will introduce our guest speaker.
Organic intellectual from Trinidad and Tobago, Dr. Merle Hodge.
You know, I want, first of all, to pay my little tribute to Ms. Patricia Charles, the list of whose achievements is quite dizzying, you know. She gave unstintingly of her boundless energy and expertise. And, you know, often when people like Ms. Charles are taken away from us at a time that we consider premature, we might consider taking the view that they have been summoned into the other world, where they continue perhaps to have an impact on our lives, and where perhaps their power to do good for us is even increased. And I'm saying this because, you know, I had this kind of experience recently, somebody in Trinidad and Tobago called Michael Alves, who was very much the same kind of person, just a very selfless person working for community, you know, endlessly, tirelessly. So Patricia Charles was certainly the same kind of person, and we are very privileged to have had her in our world for the time that she was here, not only St. Lucia, but the whole Caribbean. And, you know, she has left us. Thanks a lot. Okay, right? She has left us, but I really don't see people like her resting in peace. I see her and people like her continuing their labor of love from what might be a more powerful position. Now, in the Caribbean, in the early decades of Caribbean or West Indian independence, you're going to hear me using the two terms not entirely interchangeably, West Indian and Caribbean. When I prefer the term Caribbean, but when I want to indicate that I'm talking about the Anglophone Caribbean, I'm going to say West Indian. So that in the early decades of our independence, our discourse was full of concepts and language such as cultural sovereignty, cultural resistance, the struggle against cultural imperialism, self-reliance, etc. Many commentators considered it important that Caribbean models of development be grounded in the culture of Caribbean people if our independence was to have any real meaning. Today, sadly, these ideals seem to have departed from our imagination, and why this has happened would be another paper, right? Those ideas sound to us today like pie in the sky. But sooner or later, the question of Caribbean culture will have to be given serious attention by Caribbean societies, or there will be dire consequences for our development. Indeed, those consequences are already visible. A strong, clear, and confident cultural identity contributes to both the psychic health of the individual person and the progress of whole societies, materially and otherwise. There is a basic human need to feel part of a distinctive group which holds itself in high esteem, in high regard. For out of this, the individual person draws a certain amount of validation and self-pride. Human beings are more likely then to ground themselves in their environment and see it as worthy of loyalty, devotion, hard work, and sacrifice if they have a sense of belonging to a shared culture, a collectivity bound together by clearly recognized traditions, attitudes, and ways of doing things. So, where are we with all of this? We would need to look, first of all, at the status of Caribbean culture. The peoples who have lived together on Caribbean soil for the past 5 centuries have developed, like every other people, a set of arrangements for their survival in this environment, a Caribbean culture. There is no, sorry, I said 5 centuries. I'm mixing it up with the end of slavery. Well, however many centuries. You know we hear plenty centuries. I ain't too good at the counting part, right? So perhaps somebody will tell me how many centuries it is afterwards. Okay? But we have developed, like every other people, a set of arrangements for their survival in this environment, a Caribbean culture. There's no denying that we have produced an important new civilization here out of an historic cross-fertilization of people from what you might call the 4 corners of the world: Africa, the America of the First Peoples, Europe, and Asia. We have built upon elements that we have selected out of our ancestral cultures, and we have adapted these elements for our continued use in this environment, and we have also created new cultural forms. There are common cultural features that extend across the whole region, and there are also variations within the Caribbean community. But we need not restrict our definition of Caribbean culture to those features that are common to us all. Just as the language of the Queen and the different varieties of English spoken along the length and breadth of England, Scotland, and Ireland, as well as Scottish and Irish Gaelic, all of these are British culture. In the same way, Antiguan English Lexicon Creole, St. Lucian French Lexicon Creole, Jamaican Standard English, and Papiamento in Curaçao are all components of the Caribbean cultural heritage. So are Trinidadian roti, Jamaican patty, and Johnny cake, wherever it is found. Our cultural situation is not quite the same as in other post-colonial societies, older societies where strong, confident cultures existed before the colonial era. Those cultures certainly suffered some damage. Their development would certainly have been seriously interrupted or even stunted by the colonial experience. That is a fact encapsulated in the title of Walter Rodney's book, How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. By and large, however, other conquered and colonized peoples, when they gained their political independence, have been able to revalidate their indigenous cultures and integrate them into their forward development. They have been able to move forward with cultural confidence. Caribbean culture, on the other hand, remains to a large extent an unrecognized, unacknowledged phenomenon. We live this culture every day of our lives, but our culture is the thing without a name. It has no distinct shape in our consciousness. We can't see the forest for the trees. Caribbean culture has a weak self-image, which is not the same as saying that our culture is weak. It may be an undeclared underground culture, but it has maintained a vigorous existence over generations, resilient against the efforts of missionaries, schoolmasters, and governors' wives to stamp out any patterns of behavior that did not meet with their approval. It has shown strong defiance in the face of outright repression, as in the case of the outlawing of Afro-Caribbean religions and the stubborn resistance that has ensured the survival of those religions. Our weak self-image, for example, is manifested in the obsession that we have with being put on the map. For example, when one of our citizens receives international acclaim in music or sport, It is almost as though we don't believe that we exist unless the outside world looks at us. The definition of culture that continues to be strongly promoted by Caribbean governments does not go very far beyond the musical forms that we have produced, which are very important, of course. And their view, the Caribbean governments limiting us to that definition of culture, is related to the fact that our music has won recognition abroad. We therefore do not consider that there is much else about us that qualifies as culture. Thus, the role of ministries of culture in the independent Caribbean includes the irritating concept of showcasing our culture to the world, as though culture was something to be lodged in a glass case, rather than something that is lived in people's homes and communities every day of the week. At the moment, the idea of indigenous culture informing national development translates only into governments promoting those of our performing arts which have the potential to attract revenue via the tourist industry. In Trinidad and Tobago, the rush to monetize, new word, well, new to me, the carnival arts has had what many consider to be a most destructive outcome. It is felt that the festival is being taken away from the people, uprooted from its own history and the functions it has performed for ordinary people from its inception, and that it is being turned into an expensive for participants, and lucrative for others, an expensive and lucrative business concern. Our strong traditions of calypso and the calypso tent have been seriously undermined, giving way to trends in song that have high entertainment and money-making value, but nothing of the substance of the calypso tradition. While we harbor a very limited definition of what constitutes our culture, the findings of those who do study our culture in the broader sense sit captive in documents such as conference proceedings and monographs that are housed in university libraries around the world, making no dent on Caribbean people's need of self-knowledge and self-validation. But human societies do not generally rely on anthropologists or other academic researchers for self-identification. It is the verbal arts, an integral part of a people's culture, that provide a people with a strong and coherent image of itself, beginning with the oral tradition of literature in pre-literate societies. It is the griot, the storyteller, the composer of thoughtful songs like calypso, the poet, the dramatist, the creator of fiction grounded in a specific human society whose art assures that society that it exists. It is that person who gives a name to the thing that would not otherwise have a name. There is a sense in which the artistic representation of life is more real, more palpable than real life, because it distills body and form from the flux that is everyday reality. Real life becomes more real when it is represented in fiction, paradoxically, but that is the truth. When the stuff of daily life is fashioned into story, it gives that life a certain gravity, a certain solidity that is then projected back onto the reality. Human beings cannot do without fiction. We need fiction for recreation, both in the sense of entertainment and in the sense of the recreation, the reconstruction of our world that gives that world shape, order, meaning. It could almost be said that you do not become a people until you have a literature to articulate your reality, to give definition to your being on earth. The Caribbean has built up a solid tradition of literature that is highly respected in the reading world. But Caribbean society does not, by and large, consume its own fiction, except for oral forms such as calypso, which, again I will say, today is an endangered art form. In self-conscious societies, ancient and modern, part of the induction of the young into their own culture is to expose them to fiction that has emerged out of their own environment. Modern societies build it into their school curriculum so that no one escapes from school without some exposure to the classics of their national literature. And out of school, all of their children's literature and all of their popular fiction for adults, including movies, are firmly grounded in their own environment. But although West Indian literature has entered into the secondary school via the establishment of our own Caribbean Examinations Council, and that was a huge step, the struggle is not over. The number of West Indian citizens who actually have any relationship with West Indian literature is quite small. In the Caribbean, a knowledge of Caribbean literature does not form part of the definition of the educated. The vast majority of graduates of the University of the West Indies, the summit of our education system, have never read a West Indian novel. In the colonial education system, fiction meant the classics of British literature. Out of school, it was movies, children's books, and popular literature from Britain and the US. Today, the American film industry is the main provider of fiction to Caribbean people, with some popular literature from the English-speaking world outside of the Caribbean. And so, culture with a capital C remains in our minds something other than whatever we actually practice every day of our lives. Real culture is the culture of the metropolitan societies, set in temperate climates, that we see in the imaginative literature which we consume, or which more accurately consumes us. It would have seemed to follow logically that the coming of political independence would provide the space for us to explore ourselves and move forward on the basis of a clear identification of what makes us a people. However, before our culture could shake off centuries of British domination and begin to assert itself as a viable foundation for our development, we found ourselves facing lethal overexposure to another strong-armed, overconfident, and overbearing metropolitan culture, one that deploys methods of subjugation far more sophisticated, far more effective than those of our previous colonizers. For us, therefore, real and meaningful life continues to be located elsewhere. Independence and television came to Trinidad and Tobago in the same year, 1962. And this has been likened to the introduction of a Trojan horse. The modern electronic media, vastly expanded from just TV, are the literature of the current generation. And the process of alienation is today more insidious than before. There are alarming signs that young people born well into the era of independence may be more alienated and mentally exiled from their environment than those who lived under colonialism. One manifestation is seen in the world of creative writing. Years ago, CXC introduced a module of creative writing into the English syllabus. Lower down the curriculum, our 11+ exam in Trinidad and Tobago also contains a creative writing component. Many students automatically write stories set in a metropolitan society, usually the USA, or in a totally anonymous fantasy world, stories suspended in thin air. I meet the same phenomenon at tertiary level where I teach a creative writing course. young people who find themselves unable to apply their imagination to their own environment. They completely bypass the setting in which they live, which they do not consider real or worthy of attention, who knows. But this is just as my generation in our childhood drew pictures of houses with chimneys emitting smoke from the fireplace inside, landscapes with snow and snowmen and apple trees, and people with decidedly Caucasian features. That was a reflex action. It simply did not occur to us to draw or write about the living world that we saw around us every day. This reflex action is still here today because we continue to be swamped with fiction that immerses us in another environment. Our environment is still a place for us to escape from, physically or mentally. And one of the ways in which this negatively affects our development is that we hanker after the consumption patterns of metropolitan societies. Take, for example, the most fundamental question of food. Another of those romantic ideas dredged up from the past at the beginning of this paper was to do with food security, the call to grow what we eat and eat what we grow. Today, for some of us, indigenous Caribbean food is second-class food, to be eaten if you can't do better. Our food consumption patterns have been stealthily manipulated away from what our own environment can render, and our food import bill is unacceptably high. So are our food prices. We have allowed ourselves to be persuaded that it makes more sense to purchase food produced, quote-unquote, cheaply abroad than to fight up with agriculture on our own soil. More and more of our prime agricultural land is given over to housing, and the people living in those houses will eat mainly imported, processed food. It should not be long before all our vital supplies come in on the plain so that we live at the mercy of those who feed us. Look at the fate of indigenous Caribbean fruits. In Trinidad and Tobago, some of these are quite unknown to our children. Quite unknown. They don't know what you're talking about. There appears not to be any large-scale, deliberate cultivation for our domestic consumption of fruits such as kaimit, sapodilla. Well, you probably have different names for all of these, so I don't know. Sapodilla, five-finger, pomsite, or others far more interesting and with more nutritional value than the apples, grapes, and pears now swamping our taste. Can we sustain these tastes indefinitely? What are the implications for our future development? The quote-unquote cheap importing option turns out to be way more costly in the long run because, and only one of the reasons is the malnutrition that it produces. In Trinidad and Tobago, and I am imagining elsewhere in the Caribbean, there are children who are fed a diet of mainly carbohydrates because food prices are so high. And in Trinidad and Tobago, even our own fruits and vegetables are moving out of people's reach because agriculture is shutting down. Our development is also hampered by a certain psychology and patterns of behavior which hamper our development. And the root cause may be the lack of the strong sense of our cultural identity as a rallying point. We are yet to be convinced that the development of our Caribbean societies is worth the investment of our energies and our commitment. Now, when I speak here about the negative behaviors, if any of these are not, don't obtain in St. Lucia, then forgive me. I'm talking about Trinidad and Tobago, where perhaps we get the worst manifestation of almost everything. So I'm talking there, when I talk about the psychology and the patterns of behavior that hamper our development, there is among us a level of disloyalty to the society that we live in, which manifests itself, for example, in unsatisfactory attitudes to work, casual vandalism of public property, and degradation of our physical environment with thoughtless littering and disposal of garbage, a relatively low level of participation in the political process, which leaves our governments a free hand to run our affairs as they please, and a high rate of emigration, which is a long-standing feature of Caribbean history. Caribbean people migrate in droves to the metropolitan countries where they work tremendously hard at building those societies. The fact that we do not have a strong sense of our cultural identity also contributes to the continuing fragmentation of the Caribbean, despite our fundamental community of culture, which even crosses linguistic and political barriers. And the fragmentation of the English-speaking Caribbean alone blocks us from potential strides in development. Now I will wind down with some disclaimers, just to make it clear what I'm not saying. First of all, I am suggesting that a strong sense of belonging to a shared culture is a requirement for healthy development to take place. Personal human development and the development of a society. But I am not saying that that is all that you need, right? Solidarity based on cultural confidence is a necessary component of the thing, but it is not a magic wand. Indeed, it can be an instrument of terrible inhuman destruction, if you take Nazi Germany, for example. Human beings have got the capacity to take any good thing and warp it into an anti-human force. A sense of our cultural identity can contribute to our healthy development, but not all by itself. There are other requirements, and one of them is good leadership. Credible leadership that is not self-serving, not corrupt. Leadership that is able to mobilize the population into the project that is their own development. All hands on deck, based on a vision that the population has played a part in formulating, not one that is just dumped on them. This vision has to emerge from a stock-taking of the culture. How do people actually live? What are their strategies for survival? What are the values that they hold dear? Then, knowing the culture does not mean glorifying everything that is to be found in the culture. Every society needs to be constantly looking at its culture with a critical eye in order to identify what is working in favor of its people's healthy development, so that the strengths of its culture may be affirmed and reinforced and its deficiencies may be remedied. Cultural penetration is a problem, but you can't shut out the world. I'm certainly not advocating that. Back in the early years of independence, the Forbes-Burnham government tried to protect Guyana from the above-mentioned consumption patterns by banning television. Attempting to shut out the world, and specifically to shut off the Caribbean from America, would today be past unrealistic and ill-advised. Today, when it's not just television, but a whole explosion of communication technology letting in the world. What I am saying is that a stronger sense of ourselves will provide us with the clear-sightedness and the backbone to refuse the kinds of cultural penetration that endanger our healthy development, leading us, for example, to live beyond our means or to destroy our environment and our institutions. When we refer to our Caribbean countries as underdeveloped, and when we divide them into LDCs and MDCs, less developed countries and more developed countries, whose idea of development do we base this on? In Trinidad and Tobago, characterized as an MDC, development, quote unquote, proceeds apace with pouring more and more concrete on the landscape, turning over more and more agricultural land to buildings. Right now, they are in the process of mowing down a community, mashing up wetlands and bulldozing an ancient archaeological site, Banwari Man, to put down a highway. The people in that area have been persuaded that the roads that currently exist there, their curving country roads are too slow, and that development means getting from point A to point B at drag racing speed in clouds of carbon monoxide. They have persuaded them that driving at moderate speed along country roads, among trees, grass, food gardens, and human communities is backward. It boils down for us, it boils down to choosing. What of ours do we want to keep and what are we willing to throw away? But if we don't know or appreciate what is ours, if we have made no conscious assessment of our valuables, then we will always choose otherwise. And our valuables are not only money and resources. Our valuables include the intangibles of our human living here. In major areas of culture, what we subscribe to as right and good is not how we live. Ideology and experience are in two separate compartments. Indigenous institutions wither away because no positive value is attached to them. For example, people who live comfortably in family forms that look nothing like the patriarchal nuclear family call families that look like theirs broken homes. People call themselves single parents even when they live in a veritable nest of family. That is a term, that single parent term is one that I never heard in the whole of my growing up. That is a term that I only started to hear when I was a big grown woman. It is a concept injected into our consciousness from the metropolitan world where if you are single and have a child, then the likelihood is that you do stand alone with that child. We have been persuaded to adopt the perspective that our family forms represent, quote unquote, the breakdown of the family, because the only thing you can properly call a family, of course, is the nuclear family. So, more and more we abandon the institution that has brought us safely to where we are today, the Caribbean Family Network, which may extend from here to Brooklyn, New York, and which provided us in our growing up with more than two parents. Our parents were a whole family group. In our traditions of culture, family does not only mean the people living under one roof. It means a network of people interacting and cooperating around the socialization of children as well as the needs of the adults in that network. But that network is shrinking under the influence of other people's norms. We see it as more desirable to retreat into the nuclear household and close our door to family members for whom we would have felt some responsibility in past generations. That is the breakdown of family that we should be worried about. So, family, food, fiction, these are only three aspects of our culture that I sought to bring into focus to illustrate the need for us to urgently address the question of Caribbean culture. Maybe we need to embark upon a Caribbean cultural revolution. Thank you.
We'll start taking some questions in the middle of it. I mean, I will probably interject and give my own questions to Dr. Hodge, but I will immediately throw it out to the audience and the football fans who may have to leave early as well. No pushing. Questions for Dr. Hodge?
The knowledge of our culture has to be one that is sort of stretched out over time. And this is why I'm saying that we have to start to read the classics of West Indian literature, because the literature didn't start up today. And we will already see there that there have been changes. And these changes will continue, but if we know where we are, then we have a chance to have some kind of input into what we will lose and what, I mean, culture changes on its own, right? I mean, but we would have a sense of what we need perhaps to work hard at holding on to if it's going to be destroyed for no good reason. All right? So, some things disappear for a good reason. They're no longer relevant and all of that. But in every culture, there are things that can serve you in good stead, even in this modern world. All right? So no, I am not seeing culture as static at all. It's, it's an ongoing thing, and if we are able to, see it clearly, then we can have some input into its future development. I think that this is what goes on in self-respecting societies. They accept that it's going to change, but they they recognize the need to shore up the things that are working well. Okay, I don't know if this brings up a useful response, but I'm telling you that I certainly. Yes. Okay. All right. So, sorry. I just want. I don't want to make this fall down. Right. Okay. There we are. Yes.
I'm curious. What do you think about the links between the Caribbean culture that you mentioned when the director and the other Caribbean cultures, like the Mexican culture, the Venezuelan culture, and what are the links? What do you think about? What is the connection that we have in this different culture, but at the same time?
Right. Yes. Okay. You're talking about two things there. A link in terms of similarity, having some of the same strands, and also there's a question of contact. Right. There's a question of contact among all of these places that have so much in common, but who don't sort of interface with each other as much as they interface with the metropolitan countries. In the colonial era, there was a lot of transport and a lot of movement between each Caribbean country and its metropolis, right? Then for a while there was more, we managed to get some movement, like people who sell vegetables, about what they call the higglers, who go up and down the region. But there used to be more of a transport system then in terms of boats and ferries and stuff. Those were removed, and now moving in the Caribbean is very, very expensive. In fact, I was in Guadeloupe a couple of years ago when this was one of the themes, the whole business of the barriers and what the barriers are among us, the physical barriers, right? And one of them certainly is travel, because there used to be a ferry called I can't even remember the names now. There were two big boats given to us by the Canadians. Yes, Federal Maple and right. And that was a part of us being a federation, wasn't it? That was for a brief moment, for the brief moment of federation. But I think that is one of the things that we have to work on. I know, for example, but in terms of the similarities and the cultural links, I know that there's a lot in Venezuela that makes Trinidadians feel comfortable. Trinidadian was physically part of Venezuela in ancient history, and there's a lot of traffic too between the two places, so that we have a lot. There actually are, there actually is at least one, I can't remember how many there are, but I have a son who is very interested in Creole, and he has been visiting a place in Venezuela, and I wish I could remember the name, where Trinidadians went over in a previous generation, at the time when we used to speak, what we call patois, right? French lexicon Creole. And they are now, they are losing it, and they are now trying to have it passed on to their children. So my son and some other people go over there now and then and have sessions with teachers and that kind of thing. So that there are links. It is just that we need to be able to physically visit each other more often. We need to stop seeing the States, for example, as a place to have holidays. We could holiday in each other's house. Yes?
She introduced West Indian literature.
Yeah.
And that was very, very, very rare. When West Indians started writing books, the books were kept under lock and key in the night. And Pat Charles introduced some George Campbell's Daylight story. But she introduced that, and it's very important for us.
The other thing is, I'm so happy for you to give me that illustration of something that I always say. I suppose I put it very badly, saying that the Caribbean literature entered the school with the CXC. Because I have always said that it is individual teachers who bring about certain reforms, right? And when I came back from studying, I came home, which year was it that Pat did that? Do you know?
61 to
so far back, you see? Right, so far back. Well, yes. Well, when I came home in 1970 from studying, and I went to teach in high school and discovered that there was still, that what they had chosen on was still Tales of the Greek Heroes and all of that. Now, Tales of the Greek Heroes is Greek and Roman mythology with all kind of people with three eye and three hair and thing. But if we talk about bringing a book into school at that time with our mythology, with our Lajables and Papa Bois and company, people would have been appalled. But their mind, if the children read about elves and pixies and leprechauns and whatnot, right? But when I realized that, I decided that I was going to introduce Michael Anthony, the year in San Fernando. And I knew him, I had met him. So I ordered the books, the children bought it, and you would not believe the transformation. There was a class I had where there was a boy, I always remember his name, he and a gang of other boys used to give so much trouble in class. But I read the book before I got them to buy it. Before I ordered it for them, I read it chapter by chapter in each class. And they would sit down so quiet. And that same boy and the others, if anybody made a sound, they would almost slap them down. Because we're listening to ourselves, you know. So good. I'm glad for that information about Pat introducing even earlier than that. Yes, and I will certainly not say anymore that it was CXC that introduced it. Thank you.
We have Mrs. Williams, and then we'll have...
Thank you very much for a really interesting lecture.
Thank you.
My question goes back to His Excellency's, but in a different way. I believe he was asking about the certain Caribbean countries. With the world I work in, I find there's inclined to be a really sharp gap between the West Indian and the Caribbean. So my question isn't about Venezuela and Mexico, it's about Cuba and the dimension you were talking about.
Yeah. And the language spoken in the Dutch Caribbean, well, the languages, there's Papiamento and there's Taki-Taki, I think. All of these Creole languages have got the same story of origin in that it is a grammar base that has been recognized to be West African, but using the vocabulary of whatever was the colonizing country at the time when they were formed, right? Yes, and you know that that the Caribbean has come to a place where our governments are very willing to recognize Cuba, to run afoul of America and its stupidness, right? So that I think Haiti sits in CARICOM as an observer or something. Haiti has a place in CARICOM already. And we have a lot of contact with Cuba. Well, we have an embassy there. We have a Trinidad and Tobago embassy. People go there for medical reasons, you know, and well, in Trinidad and Tobago anywhere, but I know elsewhere in the Caribbean too, people are very open to the idea of Cuba. People in Trinidad and Tobago, well, you know, the Dominican Republic sort of sprang into our consciousness recently with the business of pelting people back to Haiti, you know, so it got a lot of focus there. I'm not sure that there's a great deal of movement between us and that country. No, but when I speak of the larger Caribbean, I'm speaking about all those countries along the top of South America and going all the way up to, well, I don't know that we have much contact with Mexico either, you know. But you know, this smaller Caribbean. Across linguistic borders, across political borders and all. The French Caribbean are making an enormous effort to reach out to the rest of us. I have been to Guadeloupe in recent times about 3 times because every 2 years they held a conference of Caribbean writers from all the linguistic regions, and I was so impressed when the person who is, I don't know what the equivalent would be in our political systems, but the person who is the head of the regional council or whatever, the really top person in government, he gave the address, and he gave it in French, and there was a screen with it translated into English. So I was following both. Then suddenly I realized that he had departed from the thing, and his departure, so that it wasn't something that he had somebody research and write down for him. He gave a list of writers of the English-speaking Caribbean that no minister in our government in Trinidad and Tobago can give. He spoke about people, and he spoke about them as though he had read them. You know, I was so amazed, right? So in many ways, the effort that they are making even though they're politically a part of somewhere else, they seem to have the leeway to do it, because it would have been the French government that funded those conferences. People going to and for that would have been quite expensive. So it seems that there's no restriction on their interfacing with us. We also have some amount of exchange in terms of school children who are doing French in Trinidad and Tobago, and exchanging with the children there and so. So it's creeping along slowly, but it could be accelerated, if the conditions were right.
If we can say that our culture is a product of our past environment, whether it be our African heritage, along with slavery, along with colonialization, and all of these things have formed the culture that we define ourselves by in the past. Could it not be argued that what we are seeing today is in actual fact an evolution of our culture, not a loss of our culture, and that what we are maybe losing is a lot of the heritage that we recognize as making us ourselves, but just the same way we say that we're exporting our culture and moving, and you're seeing a lot of our efforts and our culture being moved into North America and so on, where we migrate. What is maybe happening, especially with the advent of communications and telecommunications today, where it's now becoming more of a homogeneous world culture. Although I acknowledge the fact that there's a big divide in say Eastern culture and Western culture, but the question is Western culture becoming a more homogenized environment, and what we are maybe losing individually in our regions is our heritages. And I just throw that out.
Well, the Western people lose their heritage, right? In the evolution of their culture, they take it forward with them. They drop things that are not relevant anymore, but they still honor them.
No event of this nature takes place without the support of many persons who, each in their own special way, contribute to the whole. First of all, I would like to thank Your Excellency for your presence here this evening. No matter how hectic your schedule, your support for the Open Campus never wavers, and for this we are always very grateful. Special thanks also to members of the Diplomatic Corps for joining us this evening. We're very grateful for your support also, and we hope that you'll be able to join us for many other events throughout the year. To Dr. Merle Hodge, our distinguished guest lecturer, a very, very special thank you. We thank you for your excellent and edifying lecture here this evening, and also thank you for your very easygoing and generous manner that made organizing for you to be here to be totally stress-free. So thank you. Okay. We hope that you enjoyed your stay here in St. Lucia, very short I know, and of course we hope that you will be back soon to be with us, but of course this time for a nice vacation. It would be remiss of me not to thank our sponsors, First National Bank of St. Lucia. Mr. Robert Favrier is ill and therefore not able to be with us this evening. We wish him a speedy recovery and hopes, of course, that he takes very good care of himself. First National Bank has been our steadfast sponsor from the very beginning, enabling us to host a number of guest lecturers from around the region. It is a partnership that we treasure and a partnership that we hope remains strong and steadfast for many more years to come. To Mr. Vladimir Lucien, thank you also for partnering with us once again, as you have done on many other occasions. I always admire the ease with which Vladimir speaks, no paper needed, unlike myself. And we thank you very much, and of course, rest assured, Vladimir, that we will be back asking you to help us very soon. To the family of Mrs. Charles, I say thank you again for year after year allowing us to honor your mother for doing so much for us. We thank you for always attending, and we are only sorry that your father could not be with us here this evening. Please convey to him our best wishes, and we will ensure that he gets a copy of the lecture so he can view it at his leisure. thank the staff of the Open Campus who always work tirelessly to ensure that everything goes smoothly. And last but by no means least, we thank all of you for attending this evening. Our lectures, of course, would never take place unless you attended. So thank you very much. We hope to see you all again here next year.